Do you remember the 1980s? That little plastic box sitting beside your phone, blinking a red light. The whirring of cassette tapes and micro-cassettes inside it. That was the answering machine, a piece of analog hardware that supposedly changed America forever. But behind that little box was something bigger. Much bigger. The entire telecommunications world was controlled by a single corporate monopoly. Tech giants like AT&T had turned answering machines into a billion-dollar industry, selling them at a premium fee to every household in America. They told us we needed it. They fooled millions. And then, one day, they vanished. Was it all just a scam? To understand how Americans were fooled, you have to go back nearly 100 years. Back to the 1930s. Back to a quiet laboratory inside AT&T. The year was 1934. A brilliant engineer named Clarence Hickman, working at Bell Labs, invented something extraordinary. A machine that could answer the phone for you. A machine that could record voices. He built a working prototype, walked into his boss's offices, and proudly showed them his creation. They were horrified. AT&T executives panicked. They believed that if Americans started using answering machines, people would stop making so many phone calls, and fewer phone calls meant less money. One internal AT&T memo from that year warned that this device could destroy up to 1/3 of their entire business. So they did the unthinkable. They locked the invention away. They buried it in their archives. They hid the answering machine from the American people for over 50 long years. It was perhaps the longest corporate cover-up in modern history. For decades, AT&T's monopoly kept the answering machine locked away. But by the early 1970s, the cracks were beginning to show. A small American company called PhoneMate decided to break the rules. In 1971, PhoneMate released the Model 400. It was the world's first true home answering machine, and it was a monster of a device. It weighed nearly 10 pounds. It used reel-to-reel tape. It could hold only 20 messages, and it came with a small earphone, so you could secretly listen to your messages without anyone hearing. It was the first machine that ever let Americans screen their calls. But here is the part most people don't remember. It cost a small fortune. Owning an answering machine in the 1970s wasn't normal. It was a luxury, a symbol of wealth. Doctors had them. Lawyers had them. Movie stars had them. Ordinary families could not afford them. For more than a decade, AT&T still controlled the phone lines, and the answering machine remained a tool for the rich. Then came January 1st, 1984. The day everything changed. After decades of antitrust lawsuits, the United States government finally broke up AT&T's massive monopoly. For the first time in American history, ordinary people could buy any phone they wanted, from any store, without permission. And that is when the floodgates opened. Suddenly, electronics stores like Radio Shack were filled with shelves of answering machines. PhoneMate, Panasonic, Sony, General Electric, every company in the world wanted a piece of the prize. In 1982, just before the breakup, 800,000 answering machines were sold across America. By 1986, that number had quadrupled. Millions of units were flying off store shelves every year. Prices began to drop. The 10-pound luxury items of the 1970s shrank into small, sleek desktop boxes. The reel-to-reel tapes were replaced with smaller cassette tapes, and eventually with even tinier micro-cassettes. What was once a tool for the wealthy had now arrived in the homes of millions, and America was about to fall in love with it. By the mid-1980s, the answering machine wasn't just a device. It was a lifestyle. It was a statement. If you owned one, you were telling the world that you were busy, important, successful. You were too in demand to answer every call. But what really turned the answering machine into a cultural obsession was something nobody saw coming. People started using them for comedy. In 1986, two brothers in New York named Mitch and Ira Uspe produced a cassette tape called Crazy Calls. It was just 7 funny outgoing messages, sold for $14.95. The tape sold close to 1 million copies. Suddenly, every household in America wanted a funny answering machine greeting. Hollywood noticed too. Movies built entire scenes around them. Television sitcoms wrote whole episodes about them. Seinfeld made it famous. When Harry Met Sally turned them into romance. The Goldbergs even made an entire episode called Crazy Calls years later. The little plastic box that AT&T once tried to bury had become the most beloved piece of technology in the country. Americans believed they finally couldn't live without it. But the hype was hiding something darker beneath the surface. By the early 1990s, the answering machine had reached its absolute peak. 3 out of every 5 American households owned one. By the middle of the decade, that number jumped to nearly 3/4 of all homes in the country. Tens of millions of units were being sold every single year. Once again, the entire telecommunications industry was making billions of dollars from these little plastic boxes. But here is the secret nobody wanted to talk about. The technology had barely changed. The machines still used tape. They still jammed. They still erased messages by accident. They still needed batteries. They still broke down after a year or two. And every time the tape wore out, you had to drive to the store and buy a new one. Some companies sold replacement tapes at outrageous prices, knowing customers had no choice. It was an entire industry built on a fragile piece of plastic tape, a multi-billion-dollar empire resting on the same simple technology from the 1970s. The world looked unstoppable, but quietly, 2 new inventions were already coming to destroy it. The first killer came from inside the phone companies themselves. In the early 1990s, telephone providers began offering a new service called voicemail. With voicemail, you didn't need a machine at all. The phone company would simply store your messages for you, deep inside their network. You could check them from anywhere in the world by dialing a number. It was easy. It was free with most phone plans. It never broke. It never ran out of tape. The second killer was even more dangerous. The cell phone. By the mid-1990s, mobile phones were rapidly becoming affordable, and every one of them came with voicemail built right in. Why would anyone need a heavy plastic machine on their kitchen counter when they could carry voicemail around in their pocket? Sales of answering machines began to slip. Then they fell. Then they collapsed. In stores, the bright displays once filled with shiny answering machines began to shrink. The shelves grew smaller every year. By the late 1990s, the empire that once ruled every American home was already dying. And then, in 2007, the final blow arrived. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and held up a small glass rectangle. He called it the iPhone. And in that single moment, the answering machine, the home telephone, and the entire world of analog hardware were all sentenced to death together. Within a few short years, smartphones had replaced everything. Voicemail moved into apps. Text messages replaced voice messages. Younger people stopped leaving messages entirely. The little plastic box on the kitchen counter, with its blinking red light and its tiny tape inside, became completely obsolete. By the 2010s, the answering machine was gone. Vanished from store shelves. Vanished from American homes. Vanished from the memory of an entire new generation. Today, children don't even know what one looks like. The tapes, the beeps, the funny outgoing messages, the whirring of the rewind button, all of it has disappeared as if it never existed at all. A device that was once in 3 out of 4 American homes is now a museum piece. The PhoneMate Model 400, the device that started it all, sits today in the Smithsonian, behind a glass case. A relic of a forgotten empire. So was the answering machine really a scam? Not exactly. It was something more familiar. It was hype. For nearly 20 years, Americans were told they needed it, that they couldn't live without it, that it made them important and modern and connected. And then, just as quickly as it arrived, the world moved on and forgot it ever existed. The answering machine wasn't a villain. It was simply a victim of time. A reminder that every empire, no matter how big or how loud, eventually goes quiet. And the loudest empires often vanish the fastest.